the lobby and bring people in. And as usual, we'll try and keep it light-hearted and informative, but you know, not too serious, not too stuffy. Yeah, people can raise a hand if you say anything controversial, which is bound to happen in the next 60 minutes. Hopefully, you can say as many controversial things as you like. Anyway. Yeah, be as controversial as you like. You know, so we should be good. And then we can ask people to raise a hand. We'll open up the chat as well in the usual fashion. And then we'll post this video on the website later on. And very, very delighted to have you on board, and really, really appreciate your input. We'll probably start in a moment with bringing people in. And we, as usual, William, you know that we will get a few late stragglers as the typical fashion. So I'll start going to letting people in. So here we go. I'll start admitting all. So here we go. Yeah. Good morning, Bob. Good morning, David. Good morning, Gemma. Good morning, Jerry. Morning, all. Good morning, morning. Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Sam. In usual pension playpen fashion, if you have just joined, if you could mute, that'd be great. Just to allow William to present. JQ, if you could mute as well, that'd be great. Thanks, JQ. I'll bring a few other people in as well. So we just wanted to cut out some background noise. So mute 1 or 2. There we go. So William is fine. Morning, Chris. Morning, Peter. Oh. Good morning, Georgina. If you've just joined, if you could mute, that would be fantastic. We'll wait another minute or two just to bring everybody in and see. There we go. Chris, I'm going to mute you. So Chris is muted, that's fine. Excellent. And that's good. 10:31. Okay. William, we'll wait another 30 seconds if we may, just to allow a few more people to come in. And Charlotte, your slides are working, which is fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm assuming everybody can see the slides. Can people put thumbs up if you can see the slides? Excellent. So the technology is working. Just admitting Sophie now, which is great. So
I've logged into the playpen, so I don't know if I'll be able to get in.
There you go. That's John Quinn living, which I've now muted. So there we go. A few last stragglers. The other thing to say, of course, is good morning, Keith. Good morning, Eve. Good morning, Philip. The other thing to say, of course, is we're now recording. So for people that can't join us this morning, we'll post the video online later this afternoon. So we'll now start. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. This week, we are delighted to have William McGrath from C-Suite Pension Strategies, joined by his glamorous assistant, TC Jefferson, and the lovely Charlotte. So the technology seems to be working. We are recording. Unusual fashion. This is educational and informative. So please don't be afraid to put any comments in the chat, which we'll open up in a minute. And also raise a hand if you'd like to ask William any questions. So without any further ado, William, over to you for the presentation, if I may.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back on the playpen, and we've got a couple of ideas to run through for 2023, and they're really around discretionary increases. Not a subject which gets too much coverage, but maybe it's the time for looking at making discretionary payments to past and present employees. So that's one theme, and possibly of particular interest to some of the people on the playpen this morning. What about looking harder at what we would consider to be wasteful risk transfer transactions? Very much flavour of the month at the moment, obviously, but are they the right thing to do? So if we go into the first slide and look at the is there value in discretion? Yeah, I think there's plenty of value that can be obtained by looking hard at the way the money that's in the pension scheme is allocated. And also you need to look at whether the use of the monies that are in the scheme to pay money over to life insurers is really the right way to go. So what are we talking about? Well, we think discretionary payments in these inflationary times should be on the agenda. 10 is definitely a bigger number than 5. And perhaps it's time to think, how do we actually address payments over 5% rather than just assume that's a cap? And I think the IRM committees of lots of schemes could actually now be looking at that and thinking about not just the past employees, but actually a little bit more rounded view, look at the present employees and see if they can cover the downside. What about looking harder at the upside? And we've thought about this quite hard and looked at what is being achieved at the moment through risk transfers. And we would broadly conclude that they prove to be costly, unforced errors. What should now be happening, and I think this is where a lot of these threads come together, both in the use of discretion and the use of money for transfer, is when you look at actual payments in pounds, not actuarial ones, you start to get a different impression of the pension scheme. So that's not the way people are thinking most of the time, and clearly it requires a mindset change. But we think if you just start thinking about your pension scheme, and this is something for the corporates, not just for the trustees, think of it as an ESG flagship. You haven't got to change very much, and what has been a legacy problem actually becomes a real asset for all stakeholders. So where I think the pension scheme industry probably went wrong, we can debate LDI forever, but actually was the whole idea of it's an end game. What you really should be doing is thinking play on. So if you do that, well, what would make things different in that analysis in 2023? Well, if you actually start looking at valuations this year, as they will, well, obviously things look a bit chirpier if you're using a higher discount rate. And of course, with inflation for most schemes capped at 5, inflation well above that, well, that probably helps along in the old valuation as well. But there is a new issue, which I think is going to be a challenge for industry and for the industry, which is, you spend all this time, as Con would think, about hedging the measure, but you've left schemes exposed to actual cash payments. Now, clearly, how good is your LDI at really a cash flow matching exercise? Has it really been done as well as one assumes? Well, that's something rather like with collateral calls. Maybe that's something we're going to find out over the next year or two. Obviously, inflation capped at 5. I would argue, and I think this is something, again, not many people seem to think, that the cap at 5 isn't meant to be a limit. It was not set by Roy Good back in the 90s in their law review as being a cap. It was meant to be an emergency brake, really, on liabilities. And as you went through, you could actually see opportunities. It was expected if inflation was higher. Roy Good was concerned about the value, not the absolute amount. What would your pension actually buy? So I think that's one change. Those are changes thinking may come, but particularly interesting, I think, is the longevity table change that's coming. Now, I thought it terrific 2 weeks ago on the Playpen when we were hearing about what's going to happen on longevity and the trend lines. And the punchline really was that it's coming down at least 6 months. Well, the ONS tells us it's coming down 6 months anyway. It could easily be 12 months off liabilities. And let's think about it, that's 3 or 5% off liabilities. So windfall gain coming, and flag it up now. That, I think, is something that we should come back to at the end of the conversation. So what we think is trustees have great chance to actually think again with the scheme about where their SIP should be going. What are you trying to do? And that's really why we've been hammering away for some time now, with our friends at Kempen in particular, looking at fiduciary plus. Run the thing on long term is the tack. Why do we think run on long term is a good idea? Well, what we're doing, the industry is doing at the moment, I think needs a bit of examination. And I would suggest that the risk transfer industry, as it's developed over recent years, the life insurers have had a free pass on what has actually happened in the last few years. When you look at longevity swaps and buy-ins, we would argue, and you can see from the image, they're just unforced errors. They've just not panned out. Why do I say that? Well, I would say it's fantastic. You look at the way the risk transfer industry works, brilliantly done, brilliant. The papers they produce, fantastic. You wouldn't have thought there were so many nice colors you could put into one of your sales pitches. Beautifully done, well thought through, very persuasive, but they're really siren calls. And as anybody who remembers their Odyssey will know that the sirens were not always good things, but they were very beguiling. But if you get too close to them and listen too much, your journey came to a sticky end, not the end game you might have had in mind. So we think, and we'll come on to look at some specifics, that the financial record of risk transfers in the last decade is just dire. Financially, there's all the strategic stuff, everybody can comment on that, but financially, just dire. And what we would say is some of that isn't that easy to pick up, because there is a massive case for transparency. If you look at the accounts of corporates and of schemes, the lack of transparency, amazing. I would say that the notes, and we've done a lot of work here, are deliberately vague and very poorly written, or perhaps deliberately poorly written, just to make sure it's not too obvious just how much some of these risk transfer transactions have actually cost. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that actually, who's doing well out of risk transfer? Well, I think everybody really knows the answer is the life insurers. And there is, and I think something which needs more examination, a straightforward regulatory arbitrage between the life insurers and pension schemes. And we'll come on in a sec. Aviva is a jolly good example of all those threads coming together in one nice situation. But we would argue, I think at the moment, how could you be going into risk transfer deals believing, as a lot of the papers that from the consultants tell you, that there's good pricing out there, exceptional pricing, sort of remarkable, as one paper put it last week. Really? How do you know that? Because Solvency II is all up in the air. We know the government wants pricing to come down. The purpose of doing some of this is to get coverage from the FSCS. Well, that's up for review as well. And as we know, the longevity tables are coming down by an uncertain amount. So I think it's time for a timeout on risk transfers, not for the acceleration, which is what the industry assumes is going to happen. So let's look at a few, for instances. Aviva, what a great company. Well, it is a great company. But you look at what's happened with its own pension scheme and as it feeds through to its the corporate. Well, there's a couple of things to pick up. If you go back to 2014, it did a large longevity swap. It then followed it up. So it's actually done longevity swaps of £5.5 billion, which is not so large with this 18 billion scheme now in surplus. But you'd have to say, what happened to that longevity swap? Well, you really have to work pretty hard to find out what happened to that longevity swap. You can have a feeling it's not done so well, maybe out of the money. But the closest you can get to it is actually in the 2021 figures. There is a number for cash and other items in the asset base of the scheme as disclosed. That asset, cash and other items, cash you might have thought was a positive, receivables, that's also in that figure. You might have thought that was a positive. Then you've got liabilities and longevity swaps. Well, the net of all those numbers, and they're a hash negative number, is 3 billion. 3 billion. Is that the longevity swap number? I wonder. But that's just one part of the excellent analysis you can do on Aviva, and the team here, Pauline Keeling, who also helps us on this, has done excellent work on this. Just let's pull together some of the numbers on the buy-ins that Aviva have subsequently done. As you can see, in the pension scheme itself, they've paid premia to buy 4.5 billion. Okay, right, that's the premia, and you can see on the bottom half there, it shows up in the group accounts because all these buy-ins were done with themselves. Okay, good. Okay, the regulatory plan, the recognised plan assets at the time that these deals were done add up to 3.5 billion. Oh, so there's a gap of 1.5 billion. Right, taken over 3 years, and that all goes through the OCI. So doesn't it affect earnings because it's a decision by the trustees, and it cost 1.5 billion. Okay, fine, 1.5 billion down, but you get to the other side of the equation, and you look at the profits made by Aviva on these transactions, and you add up those profits against the recognised gross insurance liabilities taken on, and the answer is, oh, it's a profit of 739 million. Is that taken through the P&L? Not 100% clear, I would say, because there is a concept introduced by Aviva, and obviously endorsed by PwC as their auditor, of something called implied profits. Right, okay, that may be something that's worth examining in more detail at some other point. But fundamentally, you can see that there is a regulatory arbitrage here, that basically when a company transfers to a life insurer, they on the whole tend to be taking a hit, largely through the OCI. How much profit is made by the life insurer and when, obviously not always clear, IFRS 17 or changing things, but it looks like there is a straightforward regulatory arbitrage between the two regimes. So that's Aviva, well worth registering. But one of our favourites in this space is ITV. ITV was early doors into doing longevity swaps, right back in the worst year you could choose to do a longevity swap, because it's just when the trend line started changing, which is 2011. So the scheme is plugged away and done fine. So you can see the assets now are 3.9 billion, the liabilities 3.9 billion. So it's got back to nil. Well done. But in that time, since 2011, the scheme has been generously funded by ITV. It's had DB contributions, if you add them all up, and I think one of the things we've done with the homework we've been doing is looking back over time. In that time, it has had DB contributions of 941 million. Excellent. Interesting when you note how much has gone into the DC contributions, to which the answer is 185 million. Not quite such a big number. There you go. The longevity swap, meanwhile, of 1.8 billion is out of the money at the end of 2021 to the tune of the best part of 600 million. Right, 600 million. There's a lot of TV programs you can make for 600 million knocked off your assets, or you could have used it to, I don't know, pay better DC contributions to today's people. It was a decision by the trustees, not a very good one. So you then look in 2018, not giving up on the idea of risk transfer is a great idea. They did another buy-in for 530 million and took through the OCI, because obviously it makes the figures disappear, a 90 million pound hit. Didn't hit earnings, but it did hit the balance sheet and obviously involved transfer of assets. What will have happened to that? Well, it's exciting to look now to see what's going to come out of the current figures post all the changes in interest rates that we've been seeing. So it's going to be, to be advised on how big the hit against the buy-in has actually proved to be. So,
William, we have We have a question from Henry. I think Henry's had his hand raised for a while. Do you want to
Yep.
raise your question, Henry, just to
I just
take
took
stock?
it down because I googled the question, but I didn't know what OCI meant, and I suspect one or two other people won't as well. And if you told us and I missed it, I'm sorry.
Other comprehensive income.
Could you? And that's sort of an accountancy term, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. No,
Sorry.
but to me that's fantastic, Henry, because it's almost. Hang on, that's how you make all these losses disappear.
Right.
So that's how it's done. It's you know, I'm started life as an accountant, and it's just a technique. One of the techniques. Well, come on. There was actually a very entertaining webinar by one of the leading consultants involving one of the leading accountancy firms to discuss how to hide losses or write-downs through the OCI, basically saying that buy-ins wouldn't happen because the companies don't want to take anything that goes through the P&L, affects earnings. So that is why so much the discussion around buy-ins is about accounting, where the corporate will accept that the way in which the losses are taken as just being decisions of the trustees, and therefore don't count as straight losses. And it's a big point, which I think fits into the general thing around accounting obfuscation about what's really happening with some of these buy-ins. And maybe coming on a couple of the others, you'll see it's a well tried and trusted technique of keeping unfortunate information out of the P&L. It's, you know, I've many years as a finance director before I was chief exec, and you know, nobody's innocent. That's what you do. But it's what your auditors should be saying, I'm not so sure. You know, and even if you think the accounting's fine, and that's a moot point, there is no excuse for not explaining what has happened. And that is where I think there is the lack of quality in the notes to explain stuff. The fact you have to dig deep into some of these accounts to work out how much money has been transferred or has continued to be transferred with these transactions. How much better off you'd be if you'd never heard of a risk transfer transaction. So that's really, no, it's a very good question, because it's up to the heart of it. Is a lot of this stuff that's happening is driven by some accounting techniques. So anyway, next one, we got another one. That's ITV.
Sorry, does that answer your question, Henry? Does that answer your question, Henry? Yeah, good. Okay, we have got another question from, or hand raised from Peter Cameron Brown. Peter, do you want to quickly ask William your question, or?
Sorry, yes, I'm just going to say OCI was thought of by many people as below the line adjustments in the accounts, and I thoroughly agree with what you're saying. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I'll start using that. That's a much better way of describing it. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, it's good. So we move on from ITV. Commerce Bank. Yes. I love this one because I am actually a pensioner from this scheme, because it's the old Climate Benson scheme, and I worked there at one time. The scheme ended up being part of Commerce Bank. Now, I think this is a reflection again of things look different if you look at things over time. And in between 2012 and 2017, the nice people from Commerce Bank injected £213 million into the pension scheme. Okay, already closed to future accrual, that kind of thing. 213 million. That brought the assets to £1,081 billion. Right, real assets in the accounts. Okay, good. They then decided that it was jolly good time to do a buy-in. And so they did a buy-in, whole scheme buy-in, which is particularly canny technique, because it really does make sure that nothing shows up in the above the line elements of the P&L. The consequence of that is they took a £230 million hit in the accounts. 230 million. Now, obviously in Commerce Bank terms, that probably doesn't matter a lot. But anyway, so they took a big hit and bought an insurance product from those nice people at PIC. So my pension now comes from PIC. Excellent folk, very good. And we'll come and look at how much money they've been making in just a sec. Insurance products were then given out, as I say, to everybody in 2020. But one of the things that does as a consequence of that, does it have consequences? Would I prefer to have a pension from Commerce Bank than PIC? Obviously, that's a moot point, but I've now got no influence over where my pension comes from at all, because PIC could always transfer it to somebody else. But what it does mean, I think it's highly unlikely that I'm going to get a discretionary increase over 5%, because it's not very likely, though we could ask them whether PIC would do that. Whereas if they hadn't done anything, they just stuck in there, they now had whopping great surplus in the pension scheme, they could be thinking, what do I do with a whopping great surplus? One of the things they could do is pay those who've gone before, past employees, a bit better pensions, and they could be looking at, perhaps we should be paying people who work for Commerce Bank today better pensions. We should be looking to recycle, as we would have done a generation ago, some of that money. To me, that's straightforwardly a bad use of resources. But if you read the clippings from the nice people who were involved in the transaction, absolutely typical. Everybody just goes around congratulating each other on what a great job they've done in difficult circumstances. This was a marvelous transaction. So I don't think I've ever come across an area, any industry that's so prone to self-congratulation. I would just say, when you start looking at what you've actually achieved, I think there's a time for a cold shower for some of them. So they're going from Commerce Bank to one which is slightly of the moment, I would say, and is one of the things why I think Steve is still up for speaking about this sort of stuff in 6 months' time, and once back we might have a look at this, because what's coming through now is what has actually happened to companies' accounts following the events, the LDI events and the autumn of last year, and you're starting to see some big hits. But of course, if you talk to the practitioners in this space, that doesn't matter, you know, because our LDI, well, don't you understand anything? Everything goes up and down together. So it doesn't really matter that your assets have plummeted. So if we take a nice, very mainstream UK company, excellent company like Britvic, your pension assets a year ago, September 21, in your accounts were at 864 million. And this year's accounts, it's 565 million. No problem at all, because your liabilities have also plummeted. Right, okay. You then look at where I think the snagettes start to emerge. Well, the amount of money you're actually paying out, of course, hasn't changed. That's gone up just with inflation and bits, 29 million as opposed to 27 million. So now we're very reliant on the LDI program that you've been running. Actually is jolly good at cash flow matching, because you're finding 29 million pounds this year, 27 last year. And when you look at the assets as a multiple of payments, and I think that's the coming number that people should look at. Assets are multiple of payments, that's below 20. That's less than 20. That's 5% of your assets are going out this year. Now, you can say, oh, well, it doesn't matter because we're going to get higher returns on the residual assets. Yeah, maybe, but it's still 30 million quid this year. Is that an issue? Well, I might be on a limb for the industry because it's not. I think you just don't understand. That's not a problem. Well, I think it will prove to be a problem. So what else is different when you look at these numbers? And I think a couple of things. One, this scheme has no equities. And any note, okay, that seems to defy basic assumptions about risk diversification. We've now put all the chips on a very narrow range of fixed income assets. I don't think that's that smart. And it's quite interesting to see whether it be in the FT, as in today, or you're looking at The Economist, that there's going to be a big push. And I think Con Keating, as you'd expect, he's always miles ahead of the game. It's started to think about how do you cover future cash payments, because you need to give it some thought. It needs to be worked through. So when you look at a company like this, you would have thought, again, going back to our concern about obfuscation, you know, the LDI portfolio is now 130 million. It was 366 million. That's a pretty heroic decline by any standards. You'd have thought it would warrant a pretty decent explanation. I know we don't do that kind of thing in corporate accounts, you know. So I think that's an interesting topic. And then, of course, if there's one thing from looking at a lot of these accounts that say the team have done, Pauline in particular done, you get a good lead indicator. A scheme that has very high mortality assumptions, like this one, I would say 45-year-old females, average 91. Yeah, okay, good, excellent. Certainly it's the right kind of Kool-Aid they're having at Britvic anyway. So that's fine. Most schemes that are thinking about doing a well-funded or thinking of doing buy-ins or buyouts have very high mortality assumptions. Why? Because it makes the hit you take when you do the buy-in or buyout less. So that's really that. Whereas a scheme that is not doing so well, I would say is a good thing. A scheme that's not doing so well, and actually the corporate may be up against it, blow me down. It has very low mortality assumptions because it makes the deficit smaller. So I think there's a good rule of thumb that a scheme with high mortality assumptions has a strong sponsor and is expecting to do risk transfers, and the other applies in reverse. So there's another rule of thumb you can we might debate. So I think what we say out of this is, yeah, I really hope corporates have got their cash flow matching dead clear. Otherwise, you're going to have to find a lot of cash at a time when your assets are not so well. And if you haven't done that really well, so miraculously, you've got 30 million quid either in cash or is in maturing assets this year, thanks to your LDI policy, you're going to have to flog something at a bad time. And obviously, a lot of things have already been flogged to deal with the collateral issue. So, yeah, I think, yeah.
William, very good points. Henry's hand's raised, but I've got a question for you as the host, I guess. All this, some of this sounds a little bit like a very large drawdown. There's a few IFAs on this call today, Simon Crystal, for example. Sounds like a big drawdown where you start worrying about, the FCA will be looking all over Simon's business and say, well, this person wants a 5% income per annum. Is that sustainable? What if that person needs a 7%, 10% sustainable income? Then you've got to look at the investment sort of appetite and the attitude to risk and the appetite for loss and yada, yada, yada. This sounds like a little bit like a big drawdown problem. Would you agree with that? And if the FCA regulated this, and I know they don't because this is completely way away from the FCA, surely companies that are so little exposed to equities are on a hiding to nothing, aren't they? Because I'm sure Simon wouldn't advise a 65-year-old with £1 million in his drawdown pot, £500,000 in his drawdown pot, to be 2% in equities. I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, no, I think all the points are absolutely right. You need to be looking harder at cash flows. And this is, we've been making the comment about you need to look at actual pounds, not actuarial ones. And this is where I think post the LDI crisis, and obviously the team have done the industry's done a fantastic job in smoothing that over, and it's nothing to be seen, no problem. Yeah, okay, that's fine if it's really worked out as well as people suggest, and you've managed it as well as you suggest. Well, you didn't do collateral so well. I'm not sure you're so good on cash flow management, and this drawdown is a very good way of looking at it. If you're paying out 30 million quid a year, and that's real folding stuff, give or take, just using that as an example, 30 million quid. Yeah, where's the money coming from? What are you selling? Or does your LDI portfolio have a magic characteristic that actually you're always okay? So I think basically what it tells you, look really, really hard. And that's really where all the stuff we've done with Fiduciary Plus is. It's about looking at the thing in the round. It's about the asset side of the equation and the liability side of the equation coming together through a cash flow, not an actuarial assumption, which may be fine for assumptions for actuarial purposes. But no, where's that 29 million coming from? I can't see how, when you look at those numbers, that you can just say that the fact your assets have fallen that much isn't something you should be absolutely monitoring, alive to all the time. Because every other sphere of analysis or finance directoring was saying, God, my assets have fallen massively. That's a problem. Well, except in pension land, where it apparently isn't, because the assets you bought have magic powers. So anyway, so that's
William, Henry's got his hand raised. Sorry, Henry, I
Yeah.
forgot to come back to you. Can you ask your question?
Yeah, my
that'd be great.
question is, have you got an inside track to what's going on in this scheme? Or is this information readily available through the scheme accounts?
That's just all out the accounts.
So this information is coming out of the scheme accounts, and you're able to provide us with very simple metrics such as this amazing assets multiple of payments number, which I've never seen stated before. Yeah, is that regularly stated by other people, or is this a new?
No, this is our innovation. To me, it's blindingly obvious. It's a key number. Nobody does it. I don't even see it. To me, it should be.
If I'm a member of a pension scheme and I look at this number, yeah, this is the number that really, really grabs me. Yeah, it's the drawdown number, as Steve calls it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now
that's the money that's going out of the scheme, and it does give you a lot of accounts. Give you the next 5 years. Okay, that's fine, as long as you're confident your trustees and all these and all their fine consultants have that number fully managed. And if you've done a really good job on cash flow matching, it's not a problem. Probably cost you a lot to get there, but
is there anything in the accounts which explains why going from 31.5 to 19.2 in a year, as a multiple of assets payments, is acceptable? Is there an explanation?
No. It's actually TC. You might have a comment on that, because your stuff over the weekend was quite fun on this, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, I posted something related to this. In fact, using Britvic as an example, but without mentioning it in the public domain. And I had some interesting responses from those that are big supporters of LDI, who said that it doesn't matter at all, because if you're 100% in LDI, then everything is matched, and the bonds will mature at the right time to match your liabilities. And that is absolutely right. And that's the point that can be very easily be glossed over. But that is essentially right academically, and I don't know that it necessarily works in the real world, because that assumes, as William said, that you're 100% in LDI. It also assumes that your cash flows and your actuarial liabilities, which are pretty much guesswork, are 100% accurate. It assumes there'll never be any transfers out of the scheme. It assumes no one's married to a younger partner. It doesn't allow for any leverage and collateral calls. It basically doesn't allow for any unforeseen or even foreseen predictable real world events. So it's fine theoretically in an academic sense, but I think in the real world it's potentially very, very troublesome.
Yeah, I think it's, let's say it could happen in a couple of weeks' time. Let's say people thought that tax-free lump sums were going to be abolished. Yeah, you'd have a great run at the short end, wouldn't you? People would actually deferred. People would all want. Yeah, how's that going to be covered? Just at that point, that's as TC says, unexpected event. may or may not happen, but you're going to be paying out more than you expected. And yeah, where's the money coming from? And the fact is, your assets aren't worth as much as they used to be.
Yeah, I've got, I know of 3 at least actuaries on this call. We've got Chris Bumford, John Quinlivan, and Adrian Swales. Do anybody of you want to decloak and maybe comment on this, or is that is it, would that be unfair? Go on, Adrian, you can do it. Go on, JQ, one of you can do it. Decloak and have a comment.
I mean, I'm happy to say I completely understand what you're saying, and I have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying. I think for trustees, there's a real difficulty in that the regulator sort of pushes them down the de-risking route. I mean, that's sort of the only route you're kind of allowed to go, and the new funding code moves even more in that direction. So with the best will in the world, the trustees are told to sort of think about security first and foremost, and make sure that the benefits are paid rather than any discretions on top. And to my reading, the new funding code forced them away from that and more towards safety, in matching and buying out. So even if they wanted to go this route, I think they'd find it hard to justify under the regulator's instruction, essentially.
I think that they're all absolutely on the money points. That's why that's what we suggest, that really the corporate needs to make the trustees' life easier. You know, stop messing about on us and actually provide downside coverage from a third party. You know, stop messing about. You need to provide something that makes the trustees able to make what in other areas be very rational decisions. You know, you're creating problems by sort of distancing yourself from the pension scheme. You need to embrace the pension scheme, and as we would call it, you know, as TC, a memorable phrase, calls it, a corporate wealth fund. You need to think positively about your pension scheme, not as something that's a difficulty. You need to think of it as an ESG flagship. And as soon as you do that, and you address the very legitimate concerns of the trustees, they stop making rubbish decisions. And that's how we see it. And you see the consequences of this, just bringing wrapping the moving the things on again, Charlotte. So we go on to what have been the consequences of this sort of stuff. And okay, who's winning? And this is another schedule that is just one. You look at this is the PIC profitability graph over the last decades. Well, since inception, actually. And I spent a lot of time dealing with Eddie and the team back in the early days when it wasn't very profitable, and just getting going. And it's been a fantastic run. They've done brilliantly. And they've gone from a startup, it's a one product company, a bit like Rothsey, a one product company really. And in that time, they've managed to go from nothing to well over 50 billion. And in fact, you think about it, with the deal they did last week with RSA, they're going to be the UK's, you know, they're going to have more people than anybody else. They're going to make BT look quite small. So they've done a fantastic job. And you know, look at the profitability. I would say now they're so profitable, it's almost a problem. So, and where's that profit come from? That is money. Basically, if one's being unfair a little bit, or not unfair really, you siphoned out of the UK pensions industry. Okay, and their shareholders, mostly international groups, we say. Wow, that is a lot of money that's been taken out of the UK economy by, let's just take the two startups, Rothsey and PIC, both with values. The last time transactions have been done, well over 5 billion. Very difficult to tell what the embedded value of these things are, but that's just an indication of what's been achieved. Fantastic. They've done a great job. Mind you, there are people who've tried to do stuff in this space, like the Superfund or Clara, or and I'm sure it's going to be the intention of the industry is the same, will go the same way, the capital-backed solutions. They've just done the best job. For the insurers are doing well. That's why our conclusion is you aren't going to beat them. You're not. Just ignore them. You've just the risk transfer transactions that make these guys and girls rich. Very nice companies. They shouldn't be the only show in town. And that's why you need corporates to keep the risk diversification, going. They should all be doing other things. So if you go look, wrapping it up, what are the proposals? What do we think should happen? Well, I think we've done a lot of work here in the paper, and I hope people have a look through other examples in it. Really individually, all fascinating, but we shouldn't be doing this. How can the major consultants produce all their lovely glossy papers and not say that of the longevity swaps on which they've advised, that's what they're out, how much they're out of the money? And I think they are virtually all out of the money. Let's not forget that buy-ins are basically you pay up front for a longevity swap, basically, because you then transfer in all your nice index-linked gilts and all that to the life insurer. So basically, it's a wrapper for upfront paid for wrapper to get a bit of longevity cover. And you look at people who've done some of this. There's a couple of other case studies I think are particularly fascinating. L&G, don't think of poor old Aviva. We gave them a bit of a examination. L&G, the only difference between that and L&G is that L&G's commentary is even more obscure. It takes it to it's a masterclass. And Rolls-Royce, well, Rolls-Royce last week's announced that they'd written down that the liability to fallen, the assets and the liability have fallen by well over 2 billion. But it didn't warrant much of a comment. It just said it's LDI. Oh, that explains it then. That's all right. Okay. So we think one of the little things that would be a really good idea, which would make everybody put aside this obfuscation, put real proper propositions in front of people, it would make a real difference if trustees had to consult their membership before they transferred pension schemes to a third party. Doesn't mean necessarily more complicated if you've got to get as you would as a shareholder, but why can trustees just transfer schemes without consulting the membership? I didn't want my pension to come from PIC, maybe, I much prefer to have stuck with Commerzbank. I see no upside whatsoever other than the loss of discretion. I'd like to be able to tell my trustees that actually I am very concerned about ESG issues. I would like the money invested in a particular kind of way. That's all gone. Who gained from that transaction? So I think trustees and sponsors should restate their statement of investment principles. I think they should look collectively much harder at their ESG commitments. They should, again, why not ask, every single trustee body basically goes through the motions when it comes to ESG. I think that's not in their statement of investment principles. Very few, should we say, don't be too harsh, very few are thinking ESG thoughts because they're thinking 5 years minus and I'm out of here. That is very different to thinking 10 years plus and I've got a long-term plan, where the members might want their investments and that of the people who are working for the company today to be invested in an ESG aligned kind of way. So I think there's plenty of good stuff to be done. I do think that the trustees and rules need modernizing. Why not? And go back to some of the Con's great thinking for so many years. CDC, it's so obviously the answer. I think the regulatory team should all get behind it, because why not be thinking about your existing DB scheme, recycling the money that is surplus to requirements into a DC tier? That is, to me, so obvious that everybody benefits, and it gives the sponsor, if you use the money appropriately, a much better for using the money. So we think, obviously, we've come through and pulled that together. We think that's why Fiduciary Plus, which is basically this rounded approach to things, address the difficult issues for the trustees, think long term, think about today's people, think intergenerational unfairness, but think about everybody benefiting. It's just sad, really, the way the industry has got its habit. Decommissioning is all. Why? So what do we think? What are our messages at the end? Themes for 2023. Well, risk transfer transactions, the industry should knuckle down, explain itself, show why, under scrutiny, which it doesn't get, that what it's offering is a good product. Sometimes it obviously is, particularly for the weaker brethren. But is it really the time to be doing this ahead of Solvency II, ahead of the new CMI tables? Right now, I would say, completely contrary to where everybody's assuming things are going, risk transfer transactions are best avoided. So we think where you should be going is getting corporates to re-engage with their pension schemes. That's the major failing of the industry. It's failing to give corporates a reason to re-engage. But if you reframe your DB scheme as an ESG flagship that might warrant more investors looking at you because you are an ESG flagship, that's great news. And I think that mindset shift, which looks so unlikely, isn't that far away. And I think one of the reasons it's not that far away, I think past and present employees should revolt. It's just not good enough to say my priority is always to address a risk which is pretty damn remote when the gas bill needs paying. I expect I think trustees and sponsors should be saying, look, and this is where I think it goes back to the beginning and the excellent stuff we heard 2 weeks ago on longevity, there's a windfall profit coming. Why can't that windfall profit be in a tontine-like way used for the benefit of members, both those who've gone before, past employees and current employees? You could easily conclude that the right thing now for the industry after issues the last 6 months is show you can be a positive feature for the economy. You read The Economist, read the FT, and everybody's saying, gosh, this industry really doesn't help. Well, Tony Blair wrote some very good stuff in his report last week. The industry isn't doing enough. Here's a simple way in which stuff that is readily available, the trustees and sponsors in conjunction could look at ways they could help today's people who are their employees and those who've gone before, who are past employees. I think you can do better things. So we would say discretion, that is where things should be going. Discretion, we think, is a very good friend of prudence. They go very well together. And we think that can produce something from which all stakeholders will benefit.
William, that's fantastic.
There we go.
Thank you. Hands raised by Henry again, but I might ask Charles, Malcolm Brown or Peter Cameron Brown to make a comment as well. But Henry, you go first. Go on.
Okay. I do note that Sophia Singleton, in her podcast with Nico Aspinall last week, tells us that XPS are actually setting up DC schemes to manage trapped surpluses. And I'm interested because Jerry's on the call, whether Jerry or anyone other consultant would be able to sort of give us any idea about whether this is actually happening or whether it's just being talked about.
Jerry, do you want to unmute? And
I don't want to put you on the spot, Jerry. You may not want to, but
sure. Good morning, everybody. Happy to comment. I have to say, though, I don't know much more than Sophia shared with the audience last week. So I'm sure she's got plans. As to how far those plans have progressed, I'm afraid I don't know.
We could say we've harangued XPS, Wayne and the team, and Paul Cuff many times on this kind of subject. So I'd be totally unsurprised if they aren't spotting this could be a good little opportunity.
Right. Well,
are there any other consultants out there who'd like to comment? Is anyone actually doing anything about this?
I'm not a consultant, but I do have a point to make.
Yeah.
The first one is we run a DB scheme closed and an open DC scheme. Con told me that with a bit of paperwork, we can transfer surpluses across from the first to the second without incurring a 35% tax hit, which I think in itself is totally unfair. The second point is that we've avoided LDI like the plague, never mind leveraged LDI. I know that Con and Ian Clacker have been making some very powerful submissions to the Commons and the Lords Select Committees, and I believe they've also been in contact with various ministers, and certainly I've been in contact with the opposition spokesman, since that looks like it's going to be the way it goes politically. I think LDI is a cooked up way of pretending it's safe and exposing schemes to inordinate unsafety. Con was telling me the other day that for schemes heavily into LDI, they've been taking a hit over the last 12 months of between 30 and 40%. We've been 80% in equities and have resisted the siren charms of LDI, if I could put it that way. And after our payments out to members and various other adjustments in a year, we've taken a hit of 3.8%. So that to me, I mean, we made that decision intuitively, but that to me tells me that I'm making a huge mistake taking big spoonfuls of wisdom and knowledge and advice from the pension regulatory system. Because if I had, we'd be in a disastrous condition. We were looking at a recovery plan to 2036. We've got that down to 2030. I've just pulled forward a full valuation a year early, having done a mum's exercise on mortality. And because of the meltdown in the bond markets, our relatively small so-called deficit, actuarial, not real, dropped from something like 2.1 million to 900,000. That's before the latest calculations are in play. And Con thinks we are either at or very close to surplus. So we've cut our recovery plan through our investment strategy down from 2036 to, well, I was thinking probably 2025, 2026, but Con thinks probably earlier than that, which rather blows LDI out of the water in my view. And I hope others make their views, hopefully along similar lines, to the policy making system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a sensibly balanced portfolio and all this sort of stuff, and I think, yeah, there's is the way to go. You've got to address trustees' legitimate concerns, but there's no need for the industry to assume the only way forward is to give the money to the life insurers sooner or later. I think the regulator, it's fine. I think they've got a fine job. They, in many ways, I think they've done been fine. It's the corporates and the trustees need to be more clear cut in what is deliverable.
Absolutely, yeah. John Quinn-Niven, JQ, you're quiet today. Have you got any comment to make, John?
Oh, well, my only comment is we've got an insurance solution that's going to do exactly this.
Perfect. Well, there you go.
So it's going to give the best of what, as we mentioned, but all the settlement solutions that come with it.
Do you agree with some of what William's been saying today, JQ?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, some of it. There is no doubt that for sponsors having not sharing in upside, there's no doubt that from what we've heard from Stuart McDonald, some of the longevity pieces, there may be some headwinds there for individuals and I suppose tailwinds for funding, which is an interesting concept. And the key issue of discretionary increases, I think that comes into play, and to some degree the ESG piece in terms of the sponsor stroke trustees having a significant say in how assets are managed. But I do think there are some benefits of the insurance settlement world, in particular the matching adjustment piece, that shouldn't be underestimated and ignored.
So that's interesting. So the matching adjustments, clearly is going to make the life insurers offering more attractive. Nothing wrong with that. But how on earth why on earth isn't the industry waiting for it? It's not clear what it's going to be. The government wants pricing to improve. It wants new entrants into that market. That's great. So why is the industry hell bent on doing deals now when when it says it's remarkable pricing or it's the best pricing ever sort of thing? All these deals show that pricing is just you've called every timing deal wrong in the industry. So there's better pricing today than there was last year. There'll be better pricing in 2 years' time when you actually don't have information on asymmetry. You've actually got between the industry and the life insurers and the companies that have the same information. It will be a much better environment going forward a couple of years' time, and therefore you can do a much better assessment between should you go down the buyout route or the buy-in route. And obviously for many it may well be the best, people conclude it's the best thing, but particularly for those who pass gateway tests, those who are stronger. Why? It doesn't make sense financially.
I don't disagree, but we have a solution where people are going to be able to have their cake and eat it. So that's the best of both worlds. Now,
sounds like you two should meet, JQ. You should meet.
Yeah, at the moment, there's no doubt that the buyout market is at the moment an arm wrestle when it should be a handshake. It should be a bilateral agreement or trilateral agreement rather than an auction. I've no doubt.
Yeah, the life insurers are just too powerful. The fact they can pick and choose between which scheme, and most of the work that you read, all the consultant stuff, is about how to make yourself attractive to life insurers. What? This is not a normal market. This is not what you'd expect. In all other markets, I worked in lots of different markets. No, it's buyers and sellers. This is not something where you're actually being dragooned down one route. It's just not the way people should be looking at things.
Okay, William. Thanks. Yeah, have a chat. Peter, Cameron Brown, last question, I guess. So you got your hand raised, Peter. If you want to unmute. Yeah.
Yep, sorry. Yes, I must say, perhaps because I'm an accountant, I thoroughly agreed with everything William has said this morning, and really do support him, and really think this should be promoted far more widely than it is. I started looking at this problem in December, and indeed wrote a brief article which didn't get to see the light of day, but it was sort of titled, "Are you a sufferer from premature buyout?" Because I identified I was, and that my pension was bought out like yours many years ago, and I'm now faced with a very small increase on the annual pension compared to inflation. The other thing I've been promoting quite strongly is that pension schemes should be cash flow modelling.
Yeah.
That shows far more insight into the scheme, and also the insight into the assumptions that are being used for valuations. So if you model your income against your outgoings, and it's closed schemes at significant maturity, that's dead simple. Took me about an hour to do it for a scheme, just to run down, and then you put in the assumptions and you realise which are the critical assumptions, which are not. The final thing about the accounts, when I started looking at accounts, I thoroughly agreed with what you said about them being so obscure, they're meaningless. In fact, I found out that in my own sponsoring company's accounts, it's misdescribed the movements as the employer's contributions were described as the current service cost, which is fairly fundamental, and is nothing like the service cost. And the split between the above the line and the below the line in the statement of comprehensive income is very misleading, and nobody looks at it, and really it is key. In our case, the pension scheme is an asset because we're an open scheme. We have a very large surplus, which is getting very larger, and is going to currently represents about 50% of the balance sheet total of the company. It's going to be much more on the 31st of March 2023. I hate to think what it will be, but there we are. So thank you very much.
Are you allowed to say what scheme that is, Peter, or would you prefer not to mention that?
Well, I can do it. It's the United Kingdom Accreditation Service pension scheme, which is a fairly medium-sized scheme, about £70 million assets, with 500 members, and the company is a not-for-profit organisation.
Right. Okay. And you have concerns about discretionary increases, and I suppose we are a
discretionary increase scheme basis, and but it's with agreement with the employer, and when they're considering the discretionary increase that we're granting, because it appears as a past service cost, they're looking at their P&L account and saying, "Oh, hold on, it's hitting us." Fortunately, we have a non-executive director of the sponsoring company who's very keen on CDC as a concept and is actively promoting it. So what we would like to do is, in due course, transfer the scheme from DB employer sponsored to CDC in its entirety. If we could do that, we would be, I think both the employer and the employees would be very happy with that. So.
Sounds good. Sounds like an opportunity for everybody to win. So that's good. Okay, well, thank you, Peter, for that. We've slightly overrun, but it's a very sensitive and emotional and interesting subject, William. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thanks to Charlotte and thanks to TC. Fantastic. I think for me, and probably for Henry, and probably for quite a few of us, it was quite an eye-opener on the numbers and the stats, which I think a lot of members don't read. And how many members read trustee report and accounts, William? I mean, that's the bottom line. If you have to dig that deep, they've got no chance. So I think very, very interesting to get these issues out in the open. And we should take this theme forward, I guess. So thank you for your input, and thanks to everybody for listening. Next week we have, funnily enough, we have Nico Aspinall, who, as Henry mentioned earlier, I think I would call him an industry guru, and he's an actuary, and he's into sustainable investments and climate change comments and DC and CDC and everything else. So that should be quite an interesting session as well. So if you can join us next week for Nico, that would be fantastic. And if you are a Pension Playpen member, please invite friends to join. If you're not a Pension Playpen member, please sign up. You may have seen recently that we've moved to a voluntary membership. So pay what you like, pay what you feel that this is deserved. Every week we're providing great content from fantastic people like William. And we appreciate your interest and a growing community. We are now 1,300 members and growing. So thanks everybody for your input. And as usual, we say pray for peace in the East. Can't believe we're still saying that. So, thanks everyone for your time. Thanks for your input. Thanks for your questions and the comments. And we look forward to seeing you next week. So enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you again for joining. So the video will be up later this afternoon. Thanks, William. Thanks, Charlotte. And thanks, TC. So brilliant stuff. Thanks a lot. Take care. Cheers. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers, man.
Bye.